It's funny how moments of absolute clarity come to you in the dead of night. The kind that pulls you out of the mundane fog of routine and thrusts you face first into something far darker. My name is Daniel Cross, and while I might look like your average neighbor in a quiet suburb, I've long embraced the shadows most people fear to acknowledge. What can I say? People's lives intrigue me, especially when they're unraveling. This story begins, innocuously enough, in late October of 2023, though I can't be certain of the exact date. It was one of those unusually warm autumn nights, and I'd left my window open to let the crisp night air battle the suffocating heat of my apartment. I was sitting there at my desk, headset on, bantering with some online friends as I dominated yet another round of Call of Duty. The glow of my Xbox controller lit up my room in pulses, and outside, the streets were cloaked in the kind of stillness that makes you think the world's holding its breath. Then, the scream. A sharp, guttural cry pierced through the night, slicing through my casual chatter like a blade. My fingers froze mid-action, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if I'd actually heard it or if my overactive imagination had decided to play tricks on me. But it was real. Too real. A woman's voice, raw and desperate. My neighborhood isn't the kind of place where you expect such things. It's a picture-perfect suburb, the kind where lawnmowers hum in unison every Saturday and everyone's mailbox gleams like a polished trophy. I'll admit, I didn't feel fear, not at first. What I felt was curiosity. Twisted, ravenous curiosity. I muted my mic, leaned closer to the open window, and strained my ears. The sound seemed to come from the single-story house across the street, the one with the neatly trimmed hedges and perpetually drawn curtains. But as quickly as it had come, the scream faded, swallowed by the silence. I stayed up for hours that night, waiting to hear it again, but it never came. Eventually, I shrugged it off, attributing it to some drunken argument or maybe even a trick of the wind. After all, everyone wears masks in this neighborhood. Who was I to assume something sinister was lurking behind those closed doors? A month passed, and the memory of that scream had nearly faded into the background noise of my life. That is, until the day the cop car showed up. I was sitting in my front living room, sipping coffee and pretending to scroll through emails while really keeping an eye on the street. Surveillance is something of a hobby of mine. You'd be surprised how much you can learn about people just by watching. The one-story house was directly in my line of sight, as was the one to its left, a mirror image of suburban normalcy. The cop car's arrival shattered that illusion. Two officers stepped out, their movements brisk and businesslike. They approached the house on the left, the very house where I'd heard the scream. My pulse quickened as I watched them knock on the door. A woman answered, Emily, her name was, and from my vantage point, I could see the tension in her posture. She clutched a sheet of paper in her hands as they spoke, and her face twisted into a mixture of relief and despair. The scene was electric, a quiet storm brewing just beneath the surface. Of course, I'm not the type to let something like that go. I've always believed that secrets are the most valuable currency, and I was determined to uncover theirs. The young couple who lived in that house, Emily and her husband, Mark, had always seemed ordinary, almost painfully so. They'd recently had a child, a cherubic little boy with wild blonde curls and a laugh that could brighten even the darkest mood. Mark worked manual labor, construction, I think, while Emily stayed home with the baby. They kept to themselves, but there was nothing outwardly suspicious about them. Nothing, that is, until that night. In the days that followed, a moving truck appeared in their driveway. Bit by bit, the contents of their lives were packed away and hauled off. It was like watching a puzzle dismantle itself, piece by piece. I couldn't help but wonder what had driven them to this point. What had torn apart the fabric of their seemingly idyllic life? I didn't have to wonder for long. Using the Freedom of Information Act, a tool I'd mastered long ago in my endless quest for knowledge, I obtained the police report. The details were damning. Emily had filed a restraining order against Mark, citing physical abuse fueled by his spiraling substance addiction. The words on the page were clinical, devoid of emotion, but they painted a picture vivid enough to haunt me. And then it hit me, like a fist to the gut. The scream. The one I'd heard that night. It wasn't just a momentary anomaly or a drunken argument. It was her. Emily, crying out in the darkness, a desperate plea for help that had gone unanswered. The revelation didn't sadden me, no, it thrilled me. There's something intoxicating about witnessing the cracks in someone's facade, about peeling back the layers of civility to reveal the raw, unfiltered chaos beneath. Emily and her child might have been victims in this story, but to me, they were characters in a drama far more gripping than anything I'd seen on TV. I couldn't leave it alone. The thrill of piecing together the fragments of their shattered lives consumed me. Emily and Mark's story was no longer just neighborhood gossip, it was my personal obsession. Days turned into weeks, and I began watching Emily's parents' house, the one next door to mine, where she'd moved after the split. The house had always been unremarkable: white siding, a flower bed that barely survived the change of seasons, and a wooden swing set in the backyard. But now, it buzzed with an energy I couldn't ignore. Emily's movements became a routine for me to observe: grocery runs, walks with the baby stroller, and the occasional visit from friends who stayed only long enough to offer what I assumed were words of comfort. It was during one of these mundane evenings that I saw her. Emily stood by the living room window, holding her son in her arms. She looked out, her gaze distant, as if searching for something just beyond her reach. The little boy tugged at her hair, giggling, but her expression didn't change. That's when it struck me: she wasn't just surviving, she was waiting. For what? Or whom? The thought lingered like a puzzle I needed to solve. The quiet of the neighborhood only amplified my curiosity. So, I decided to escalate my investigation. Late one night, I crept outside and positioned myself behind the tall hedge that bordered their backyard. From there, I could see the faint glow of a television illuminating the living room. The scene inside was painfully ordinary: Emily folding laundry while her parents watched the evening news. Yet, even in their shared space, she seemed isolated, a ghost moving through the motions of normalcy. It was then that I spotted the journal. The leather-bound book sat on the kitchen counter, its spine cracked and pages bursting with inked scrawl. I'd seen Emily write in it several times, her pen flying furiously across the paper as if her thoughts couldn't wait to be freed. What secrets did it hold? Confessions of her abuse? Fears for her future? Or something deeper, darker? My imagination ran wild. I knew I had to get my hands on it. A week later, the opportunity presented itself. Emily's parents had left for the weekend, and she'd taken her son out, probably to the park or some playdate with one of her few friends. The house was empty, and I knew the layout well enough to act quickly. I crossed the yard with the ease of a predator stalking its prey, slipping through the unlocked back door like a shadow. The journal was right where I'd last seen it. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the cover. Inside, the pages were filled with messy, hurried handwriting, the words tumbling over one another in a chaotic frenzy. I skimmed through the entries, each one more revealing than the last. Emily's pain was laid bare in those pages: the bruises she'd hidden, the nights she'd spent cowering in fear, the moments of shame and doubt that had nearly consumed her. But there was something else. Something unexpected. A name. Over and over again, in the margins of her entries and woven into her chaotic narratives, she'd written the name Daniel. My name. At first, I thought it must be a coincidence. Maybe there was another Daniel in her life, a coworker, a friend from her past. But as I read further, the truth became inescapable. She knew. Somehow, she'd noticed me watching, sensed my presence even when I thought I'd been careful. Her entries weren't just a chronicle of her abuse, they were a record of her paranoia, her growing awareness of the eyes that followed her every move. My heart raced as I read her words. "I can feel him watching," one entry said. "He's always there, just out of sight. I don't know who he is or what he wants, but I can't shake the feeling that he's waiting for me to slip up." A thrill surged through me. She'd noticed me, yes, but she didn't know who I was. Not yet. That meant I still had the upper hand. But it also meant I needed to be more careful, more deliberate in my actions. The last thing I wanted was to scare her off before I'd unraveled every thread of her story. As I closed the journal and placed it back on the counter, a new thought took root in my mind. Emily wasn't just another subject of my curiosity. She was a challenge, a puzzle I needed to solve. And I wouldn't stop until I'd uncovered every secret she'd tried so desperately to hide. My discovery of Emily's journal changed everything. It wasn't just about piecing together her past anymore, it was about shaping her future. The idea that she'd sensed my presence, that my existence had wormed its way into her mind, was exhilarating. I couldn't stop thinking about the way her handwriting grew more erratic when she mentioned me, as though my unseen presence was tearing at the edges of her sanity. But I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Over the next few weeks, I took my observation to the next level. Emily's routines became my own. I noted when she left the house, when she returned, even the days she took out the trash. Her walks to the park with her son became my opportunities to linger nearby, always careful to remain just another face in the crowd. Occasionally, I'd catch her glancing over her shoulder, her eyes darting nervously as though she could feel me there. It was almost amusing how predictable she was, how easy it was to stay one step ahead. One evening, I decided to test the waters. I waited until she'd taken her son upstairs for bed, the soft glow of the nursery light casting shadows across the yard. I'd positioned myself in the alley behind her parents' house, just out of sight but close enough to see her through the kitchen window. She was cleaning up, her movements mechanical, her face blank with exhaustion. I let a pebble slip from my hand, the small sound startling her. She froze, her head snapping toward the window. For a moment, our eyes almost met, or at least it felt that way. Then she drew the curtains, shutting me out. But I knew the damage was done. I'd planted a seed of doubt, a lingering question in her mind: was she really safe here? The next day, I noticed a change in her. She was more guarded, her glances sharper, her movements quicker. She'd started locking the doors more frequently, checking the windows before leaving the house. It was almost endearing how hard she tried to maintain control, even as her paranoia began to take hold. But I wasn't content to stop there. Emily's fear was delicious, but I wanted more. I needed her to understand that no matter what she did, no matter how hard she tried to escape, I was always watching. One night, I left a small token for her to find, a single white feather placed carefully on her front porch. It was innocuous enough to seem coincidental, but just strange enough to unsettle her. I imagined her finding it the next morning, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of it. Would she think it was a gift? A warning? Or something worse? The following evening, I escalated. While her parents were out and she was busy putting her son to bed, I crept into the backyard and left another feather on the windowsill of the nursery. This time, I stayed to watch. When she came downstairs and saw it, her reaction was everything I'd hoped for. She froze, her face pale, her hands trembling as she reached for the feather. She glanced around wildly, her gaze sweeping past my hiding spot but never quite landing on me. It was perfect. She was unraveling, just as I'd planned. But even as I reveled in my success, a part of me knew this game couldn't go on forever. Emily was strong, stronger than I'd anticipated. Despite her fear, she continued to go about her days, determined to maintain some semblance of normalcy for her son. It was almost admirable, in a way. Almost. Still, I wasn't ready to let her go. Not yet. There was still so much more to uncover, so many layers to peel back. And as long as she kept fighting, I'd keep watching, waiting for the moment when she'd finally break. Because that's the thing about fear. It's not just a reaction, it's a process. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that breaking someone isn't about striking all at once. It's about eroding their foundation, one piece at a time, until there's nothing left but the raw, trembling core of who they are. And Emily? She was my masterpiece in progress. Emily's resistance, though admirable, only deepened my fascination. She had become a creature of habit, locking the doors and windows each night, checking on her son with a frequency that bordered on obsession. Her fear, tangible and electric, seemed to radiate through the walls of her parents' home. It was thrilling. But even the most carefully constructed walls crumble under enough pressure. The culmination of my efforts came on a quiet Friday evening. Her parents were out, as they often were on weekends, leaving her alone in the house with her son. From my vantage point behind the tall hedges in the backyard, I watched as she settled into the living room. A book lay open on her lap, but she wasn't reading it. Her eyes darted toward the window every few minutes, her body tense, as though waiting for the inevitable. She wasn't wrong. I'd prepared my final act carefully, ensuring that everything would fall into place. It started with the lights. A carefully severed wire outside the house plunged the living room into darkness. Through the window, I could see her startle, clutching the book tightly. Her silhouette moved toward the kitchen, presumably to check the circuit breaker. I slipped inside through the unlocked back door, she'd forgotten it in her haste. The house was eerily silent, save for the soft creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. I stayed in the shadows, watching her move from room to room, a flashlight casting trembling beams of light across the walls. Her breathing was shallow, her footsteps hesitant. She called out once, a tentative hello, that echoed through the empty halls. I didn't answer. When she returned to the living room, I made my presence known. A faint sound, a deliberate scrape of metal against wood, was enough to freeze her in place. She turned slowly, her flashlight sweeping across the room until it landed on me. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Her eyes widened, her lips parted in a silent gasp, and the flashlight slipped from her trembling hands, clattering to the floor. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heartbeat. I stepped forward, letting the dim glow of the fallen flashlight illuminate my face. "You already know who I am," I said, my voice calm, almost soothing. "You've been writing about me for weeks." She took a step back, her body pressed against the wall. "Why are you doing this?" "Because I can," I replied simply. "Because you interest me." Her eyes darted toward the stairs, toward the nursery where her son slept. I followed her gaze and smiled. "Don't worry. He's safe, for now." The fear in her eyes was intoxicating, but it wasn't enough. I wanted to break her completely, to see the moment when her defiance crumbled into submission. "You think you're in control," I continued, stepping closer. "That locking doors and checking windows will keep you safe. But you've never been in control, Emily. You've been living in my world, playing by my rules, and you didn't even realize it." She tried to run then, bolting toward the stairs. I let her go, savoring the chase. She reached the nursery and locked the door behind her, but it was a futile gesture. The old wooden door gave way with a single, forceful kick. She stood in front of the crib, her arms outstretched protectively, as though she could shield her son from me. "Please," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "Don't hurt him. He's just a baby." I tilted my head, considering her words. "Hurt him?" I repeated, feigning surprise. "Oh, Emily, you misunderstand. This was never about him. It's always been about you." And then, I left. I didn't touch her, didn't harm her son. I didn't need to. The damage was already done. As I walked away from the house, I knew that Emily would never feel safe again. She'd spend the rest of her life looking over her shoulder, jumping at shadows, haunted by the memory of a presence she could neither predict nor escape. And that, to me, was the ultimate victory. Emily was no longer just another woman with a tragic past. She was my creation, my masterpiece, a testament to the power of fear and the fragility of the human mind. And as the night swallowed me whole, I couldn't help but smile. The story wasn't over. It was only just beginning.